Within the veiled chambers of the Ottoman Imperial Harem, far from the sunlight that gleamed upon the minarets and marble courtyards of Topkapi Palace, an unseen world flourished where beauty was currency, silence was survival, and cruelty often hid beneath the shimmer of silks and jewels. For behind the ornate lattice windows where no man other than the Sultan himself could enter, the harem was less a place of romantic fantasy and more a labyrinth of secrets where women, concubines, odalisques, favorites, and queens were bound not only by gold and embroidery, but by chains of fear, rivalry, and ruthless ambition. For every corridor whispered of betrayals, every fountain concealed the echo of tears, and every luxurious chamber carried the lingering scent of incense mingled with the memory of suppressed cries. And as the empire stretched across 3 continents with its armies feared and its sultans glorified, inside this secretive inner court there unfolded battles as fierce as those on the battlefield, only instead of swords and cannons, the weapons here were poison, whispers, seduction, and silence. And the women who lived behind these doors knew that to rise even one step in rank was to risk their lives. For the sultans, I could elevate a slave girl from obscurity to power, while a single mistake, a single rival's scheme, or a moment of lost favor could condemn her to exile or execution. And thus the harem became both prison and throne, a stage where lives were woven into stories of blood and silk. And though the world outside dreamed of it as a paradise of luxury, inside it pulsed with hunger for power, the shadow of cruelty, and the endless struggle for survival, as young girls taken from distant lands, Circassian villages, Balkan hamlets, Anatolian farms, were brought here in chains or by trade, some sold by desperate families, others captured in wars, their eyes wide with fear as they passed through gates that shut them forever from the world they knew, learning strange languages, forced into strange customs, trained in music, dance, and obedience, molded to please, and yet many grew into more than ornaments, for within them sparked ambition, intelligence, and courage, and they learned that behind a smile could be hidden a dagger, behind an embrace, betrayal, behind a lullaby, the scheme of a woman dreaming to make her son the next sultan. And in this crucible of rivalries there arose legendary figures, women whose names history still whispers. Roxolana, once a slave from Ruthenia, who captured the heart of Suleiman the Magnificent and transformed herself into harem sultan, breaking centuries of tradition by marrying him, ruling beside him, and manipulating court politics with ruthless cunning. Kozum Sultan, who became regent of the empire and wielded more authority than many viziers, but who also orchestrated assassinations, poisoned rivals, and drowned enemies in the cold waters of the Bosphorus. Turhan Sultan, who strangled her own mother-in-law to secure power, then ruled as Valide Sultan and guardian of her young son, directing the empire from behind the screens, showing that the harem was not a house of passive beauties but a throne room of hidden queens. And yet for every woman who rose, 100 others perished nameless, their stories swallowed by silence, their bodies discarded into unmarked graves, their tears drying unseen. For cruelty was as constant as the muezzin's call echoing over Istanbul, and the punishments within were as merciless as any battlefield. Rivals smothered with silken cords, accused girls drowned in the Bosphorus at night, their bodies weighted with stones, favorites exiled to distant palaces never to return, and even children, young princes, murdered in their sleep to prevent civil war, their mothers screaming into pillows so their grief would not reach the ears of the Sultan. And in those screams was contained the truth that the harem was both cradle and grave of empire. For here were born the sons who would become rulers, but here too they were often strangled before manhood, victims of the empire's law of fratricide, and thus the women lived in a constant state of fear, for the higher one climbed, the greater the fall, and a single whisper could end a dynasty. As servants carried trays not only of sherbet and fruit, but also goblets of poison, as eunuchs patrolled, not only to guard chastity but to enforce silence, their black robes gliding like shadows, their eyes cold with obedience. And in the evenings, when lanterns flickered and oud melodies floated through the air, the women performed dances and songs, their faces painted with calm, but behind their eyes raged storms of plotting, love, hatred, longing, and despair, for each one knew she was both prisoner and player. And while the empire outside conquered armies, inside these gilded cages were conquered hearts, broken dreams, and silenced voices. And those centuries later poets, travelers, and painters would romanticize the harem as a realm of exotic beauty. The truth remained darker, soaked with the blood of countless victims, echoing with the cruelty of ambition, and engraved forever as a hidden empire within the empire itself, where every smile was a mask, every gesture a performance, and every night a gamble between survival and destruction. For to live in the harem was to dance, with death beneath the shadow of the Sultan's throne. Beyond the first veil of mystery and cruelty that defined the Ottoman harem, there lies a deeper layer of untold stories. For if part 1 revealed the physical confinement, rivalries, and the merciless punishments, then part 2 unveils the psychological, spiritual, and imperial weight of this hidden empire within the empire, showing how the harem was not merely a stage for personal ambition but a silent engine that drove dynasties, shaped political destinies, and carved history with invisible hands, because the Sultan himself, though outwardly supreme and revered, was often caught in the web spun by the women of his harem. For while the janissaries stood with their spears and viziers argued in the council chambers, decisions of war and peace, of alliances and executions, were often first whispered into his ears by the valiant Sultan, the Queen Mother, or by a cunning favorite who had learned that a sigh at the right moment could weigh heavier than an army, and a tear shed upon the Sultan's shoulder could redirect the fate of nations. And so the harem, cloaked as a private household, became the unseen parliament of the empire, where every lullaby sung to a prince was a prelude to a political scheme, every cup of sherbet carried by a servant was a test of loyalty, and every smile exchanged in those gilded halls might mask a death sentence. And thus, while chroniclers wrote of conquests in Hungary, victories in Arabia, or losses in Vienna, behind the veils of the harem women fought battles of their own, subtler but no less deadly, battles whose victories reshaped the course of history without ever raising a sword. And here the cruelty was more insidious than the silken cord or the poison vial. It was the cruelty of hope betrayed, of mothers watching sons taken from their arms, of women forced to bear children only to know those children might be strangled at the dawn of succession, of concubines who gave the best years of their youth and beauty only to be cast aside when their shine dimmed, their bodies discarded into the anonymity of the old palace, where forgotten women wandered like ghosts of once cherished jewels. And this slow erosion of spirit was in many ways worse than death, for while the empire's laws allowed for murder in the name of stability, the greater cruelty was how lives were wasted in endless waiting, in silent obedience, in being taught to bow and to smile while inside their souls screamed for freedom. And yet there was no escape, because once a girl entered the harem, the gates closed forever. And whether she rose to power as a queen mother or withered in silence as a nameless odalisque, her destiny was sealed. And even the eunuchs, those silent black-robed guardians, knew that they too were prisoners of this system, mutilated men turned into tools of control, condemned to a life of watching others' passions and pains without ever tasting the sweetness of family or love. And thus the harem was a prison not only for women, but for men too. A kingdom of shadows in which every soul was trapped by the Sultan's throne. And as centuries passed, the cruelty took new forms, because as the empire weakened, the power of the harem grew, until viziers and generals resented the sway of women, and the streets of Istanbul whispered of the Sultanate of women, a phrase both feared and mocked, for it meant that the mightiest empire in the Islamic world was being steered by the secret tears, embraces, and intrigues of women hidden behind curtains. And so many of the empire's triumphs and tragedies can be traced not only to the battlefield but to these hidden chambers, where an ambitious mother might urge her son to execute his brothers, where a grieving concubine might poison a rival prince, where alliances with foreign ambassadors were sealed not by treaties, but by seductions and secret gifts carried through the harem's gates. And all the while the women themselves lived in a paradox of splendor and despair, clothed in silks but starved of freedom, surrounded by jewels but denied the simplest joys. And though painters later imagined them reclining in languid luxury, The truth was that many nights they lay awake trembling, fearing the footfall of eunuchs bringing news of exile, or the arrival of guards with the fatal bowstring, or the quiet order to drown them in the Bosphorus. And the cruelty was not only in what they suffered, but in what they inflicted, for to survive in the harem was to learn to be cruel, to strike before being struck, to betray before being betrayed. And so mothers sacrificed daughters, sisters betrayed sisters, lovers turned to executioners, and children grew up knowing that their mother's survival meant another's death. And in this endless cycle of fear and ambition, the harem became a mirror of the empire itself, outwardly glorious, inwardly decaying, outwardly unified, inwardly divided by suspicion and treachery. And so when the empire finally crumbled centuries later, when its armies faltered and its provinces broke away, one could say the seeds of its downfall had long been sown in those shadowed chambers, where cruelty had consumed love, where ambition had strangled loyalty, and where an empire built by warriors was slowly undone by whispers in the dark. And thus the story of the Ottoman harem is not only a story of hidden cruelties but also a parable of power itself, showing that no empire, no matter how vast, can endure when its heart beats in chains, when its throne is surrounded not by loyalty but by fear, and when its legacy is written not in the sunlight of justice but in the shadows of cruelty.